It's a historic setting down there on the Todd Ranch, and I'll talk about Mr. Todd a little later on here, but the ranch, my father moved there in 1954, and that was the year that I graduated from high school. So I never spent a lot of time there. I was either in college or in the military or back into veterinary school and then into practice. So my life was pretty well consumed with making a living and raising my family. And not until retirement did I move down to enjoy what I call God's little acreage there. And I always felt like we really don't own it. We're just caretakers for the good Lord, and it'll pass on to next generation. But let's go back to Mr. Todd. He's the person that the ranch is really named after. Even though it's been in my family for 64 years, Mr. Todd owned it and ran it for 20 years, and then his son for another 10 years. So the total time between Mr. Todd and his son was only 30 years, where we've more than doubled that time of ownership of the property. The original ranch was started back in 1885 by a man by the name of George Fowler, and he came out and bought land. The government had sold land to the railroad for $1 an acre, and this encompassed a strip of land 10 miles wide, 5 miles on each side of the track, and then that land was sold by the railroads to make money to build their tracks. Now, that didn't mean that the track was built where the money was raised. They may have sold the land in Kansas and built a track in Ohio. But anyway, that's the way the railroads expanded. But this gave the opportunity for young businessmen to venture west and purchase land. The Fowler family was in the meat packing business, and they had packing plants in New York, Chicago, Kansas City. I think they had some overseas in London even. But that's where the money came from, that he purchased several thousand acres and put together the Fowler Ranch. Now, there was an adjoining neighbor, Mr. Pierce, that also came out, and he was the son of a railroad executive in Chicago that could see the opportunities here in the prairie. So he came out and established a ranch to the west. Mr. Todd and Mr. Fowler both wanted the town of Maple Hill to be on their properties. And as it turned out, there was quite a fight between the two of them to see who would have the place. Well, Mr. Fowler invited people to come out by train from St. Joe and Kansas City, and he threw a big barbecue at his ranch, and he had platted out a site, and they sold off lots, and that's how the town of Maple Hill was founded. So I like to think that maybe right in the middle of my barnyard, where there's an old foundation from a previous barn, is maybe the site that where the town of Maple Hill originated. I'm going to go back now to Todd. Mr. Todd was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and came over to the United States in 1865. He came to the United States the same year my grandfather settled in Kansas. But Mr. Todd was the manager of the Prairie Land and Cattle Company. Now, the Prairie Land and Cattle Company was one of the largest, if not the largest, free-range grazing operations in North America. And as typical of most all of those big operations back then, they were owned by mostly English or Scottish firms that owned the land. So that's how Mr. Todd fit in, being from Scotland. But he came over and was the manager of that ranch. They didn't own the land, but they controlled the grazing rights and the water rights. Their business office was in Trinidad, Colorado, and their operations ranch, where Mr. Todd lived, was at Folsom, New Mexico. They controlled the land from Trinidad, Colorado, to Amarillo, Texas. That's 300 miles, 6 million acres. Very large operation. I think there was a blizzard back in 1881. I think that was the year of it that really wiped out thousands of head of cattle. And that was kind of the start of the fall of the ranch. And then the people coming in and settling and putting fences, and the land gradually disappeared. But Mr. Todd purchased a portion of it, the Cross L Ranch at Folsom, New Mexico. Interesting, in his future then, the way that worked, the railroad that runs through Maple Hill, Kansas, runs through Folsom, New Mexico. So Mr. Todd could, when he came to Maple Hill, could get on the train, go out there where they kept their cow herd, and then bring their calves back here to feed them out and graze them on the Flint Hills. Okay, back to Mr. Todd. His name is spelled T-O-D, and he always made the comment that if one D was good enough for God, it was good enough for Todd. The history behind Mr. Todd makes our ranch will probably forever be known as the Todd Ranch and not the Brethour Ranch. Mr. Todd was, after he bought the ranch from Fowler, then he came and built 2 big houses on the place, one for his son and one for himself. Interesting, the first house that they built was finished, and then they went on the hill to build the second house. While they were constructing the second house, the first house caught fire and burned down. The day after Christmas in 1914, I believe it was. I think it was either 14 or 16, that house burned down. And Mr. Todd happened to be in Kansas City at the time, and the ranch hands, when he got back, told Mr. Todd that we were unable to get the safe out of the house, but we did rescue all of the scotch. Sure, got the important things first. So that house, the second house, or the house that burned, was rebuilt then, and that's the house that I presently live in. That's where my parents had lived. And after my father died, the house sat idle for several years, and then my wife and I remodeled and added to it and restored life to the house, and that's our family home now. The ranch at the present time has 4 houses on the ranch. 2 of these at one time were rentals, but there were originally more houses than that, because back when Mr. Todd was operating the ranch, I'd understand that he employed 40 men full-time. There were houses for the married men to live in, and then there was a large bunkhouse where all the single cowboys lived. And I found a very interesting piece of information at the Kansas Historical Museum in Topeka. In 1912, a young boy, 15 years old, came out to the ranch to work for Mr. Todd. His father was the headmaster of the Princeton Preparatory School back in Princeton, New Jersey. And Mr. Todd has sent his son there to go to that prep school, and he ended up going to Yale University for his degree. But anyway, Mr. Todd established a relationship with the headmaster, and so the headmaster, when his son graduated from high school, he didn't think that he was mature enough to go to college, so he sent him out for 6 months to work on Mr. Todd's ranch. This young man, 2 times a week, wrote a letter back to his family. Every letter is started out, "My dear mama," and every letter ends, "Your loving son." And he documented what he did on the ranch. It's probably the best compiled information of what actually took place on a working ranch in that era that I have ever come across. But he talked about the people that he lived with in the bunkhouse, because Mr. Todd brought over a lot of people from Scotland to work. And they were young men from Scottish background or Irish that came over, and some of those families are still in the Maple Hill area. It's just amazing what he talks about. He said one day night, it was in the middle of the night, was a fire in Maple Hill, and he said that he got dressed, saddled his horse, and got to Maple Hill in 7 minutes. I can't get there that fast today driving. But it's just fascinating. He did say also that he went over to Maple Hill to buy some work gloves, and he made a comment that Maple Hill was a little town with not one tree. Now that would have been in 1912. He said there was not one single tree in the town of Maple Hill. So it's interesting. Okay, Mr. Todd then, he was a pioneer cattleman that was involved in everything. He was president of the Board of Regents for Kansas. He was instrumental in organizing the Kansas Livestock Association and was one of the first presidents. He was one of the organizers of the American Royal in Kansas City. He was one of the organizers of the Wichita Fat Stock Show. He showed his cattle at all the major livestock shows in the country, and was a very powerful individual and very well known, widespread all across the country. He died in 1928, and his son took over and operated the ranch for another 10 years till 1938. At that time, why he sold the ranch then. His wife was an Adams. Mabel Ray Adams was a sister to Raymond Sr. Adams. Well, and Horace Adams purchased the ranch when Jim Todd sold it, and then after a few years he sold it to Raymond E. Adams. Today, most all of the pasture land that was in the Todd Ranch is now the Adams Ranch. The land to the east of our ranch and the land west of Maple Hill is now all Adams Ranch. I would guess that at its peak it was probably around 15,000 acres, would be my guess. There were 40 men who worked full time, and according to this young man that wrote these letters, there were two crews of people. One group drove the teams and did the farm work, and the other group were cowboys that rode the horses and tended to the cattle. And they built I don't know whether it was Fowler or Todd, I think it was Fowler, had built large grain bins up along the railroad track at Maple Hill. And they owned some land, and he bought corn from farmers over in the river bottom and would bring it over. And this young man tells about how many thousands of bushels of corn that they could store in the buildings there. But interesting, some of the people, and I got acquainted with one man when we first moved down there. There were still some of the people around who had worked for Mr. Todd. And this one neighbor, he said he spent all day going to town, loading up his team wagon with corn, driving out to the feedlots and shoveling it off by hand with a scoop shovel, back and forth trips. That's all he did all day long was feed cattle. They fed out thousands of head of cattle there in that river, in the creek bottom there at Maple Hill. Okay, after the Todd Ranch was sold into Adams, they had it in their hands during the from 38 until the mid-40s. And in the 40s, Phil Glunt, who had been moved out from the Zinedale, or not the Zinedale, the area north of Manhattan on the Tuttle Creek Dam area, and I can't think of the name of the town, but they were going to be moved out of there. So he purchased this ranch, but he only bought the headquarters and some of the surrounding. I think he bought probably around 1,500 acres. And he farmed that from the 40s up until 1954 when my father purchased it from him. Interesting, there'd been a previous bridge across Mill Creek which had washed out probably in a flood during the 1930s. I think there was a big flood. And so they were using a low water crossing, which was just big tubes in the creek with concrete, and it wasn't very wide. I know Raymond Jr. Adams told me that he was there farming, helping when they owned it, and he said if you really wanted a thrill, drive a team with a silage wagon across that low water bridge, because there was just room for the wagon with about a foot to spare on each side. And he said that would get your adrenaline flowing. Anyway, Phil Glunt was on a trip with a friend of his, Mike Oberhelman, who was a banker in Topeka. And they were close friends, and they were on a trip traveling across Oklahoma, and they passed a construction site, or a deconstruction, I guess you'd call it, where the railroad was tearing down a bridge. And Mr. Oberhelman said to Phil, Phil, you ought to buy that bridge. Take it up there and put it across the creek. And they joked about it, went down the road about 20 miles, made a U-turn, went back and purchased the bridge. Shipped it by railroad up to Maple Hill. And Phil tried to find a contractor to put the bridge up. And he said that the cheapest one he could find was $75,000 to build that bridge. Well, back then, that was real money. And that was along about 1950. So he hired a crane operator and rented a crane, and I became acquainted with the crane operator to verify this story. It was Cecil Swatzel that lived up by St. George, and he said that Phil Glunt had a good friend, Bill True, that lived on about 6 miles west on a farm, but they were college friends, and Bill True was a civil engineer graduate from Kansas State. So the two of them put this bridge together by themselves. And Cecil Swatzel, the crane operator, said he would sit down in the creek bed with the crane and move these big girders up there, and those two cowboys walked on those beams and put those bolts and rivets in wearing cowboy boots. He couldn't get over that. But it is 180 foot long, one of the probably largest private bridges in the state of Kansas. But Phil Glunt was the person who put that bridge in. 51 flood came as they were building the bridge and went over the deck of the bridge. But the bridge is placed probably just as strong today as it was in 1950-51 when it was put in.